Hi everyone, good morning. Almost afternoon. On a different schedule. As I said, I just came back yesterday from maternity leave, so my schedule is morning, afternoon, all morphed together. So it's just actually really fun and wonderful to be here teaching everyone today. Our topic that we'll spend the next few weeks is entitled Search for Sacred Space. And I wanted to just spend a moment as I introduce myself and then introduce the topic on how I kind of evolved into this topic and decided to do this topic. So I'm Shira, Hecht-Koller. I teach Gemara here at SAR High School, freshman and senior Gemara. So I get the bookends of the experience. My background is in law and Judaic studies, so I kind of lump those together in the Gemara class. And often when I do classes like this, in addition to things that I normally teach and kind of have the background in, I also just like to explore hobbies and passions that I think can be enlightened through our texts. So this series is one that is kind of evolving for me, the search for sacred space. And I'll just spend a moment talking about how I kind of became interested in this. It kind of evolved from teaching here in this space and all the different spaces that we inhabit in this building and the unique architecture of this building, after having taught in other environments and teaching simultaneously in other environments. And it just became so apparent to me, and I know we kind of know this, but it just became so apparent to me how space impacts the way we feel, the way we learn, the way we develop, the way a student can relate to a text on a particular day in a particular moment can heavily be influenced whether they're sitting around this table, whether they're sitting in the Beit Hamikdash, whether they're sitting in an open room, and how the architecture and the sort of spiritual space that's built around the architecture really impacts that. So that was kind of just my own teaching experiences, teaching here, teaching in camp, the same kind of material can be presented and really speak to people in different ways based on the space that we're in. And it just got me thinking about space in general, sacred spaces in particular, and how the different environments influence us. So when I was remodeling a home at the same time, kind of bought a new home, an old home, and just remodeled a bit, all those issues came to fore. Like, what kind of space did I want this to be? And after living in a tiny apartment for many years with a few kids, right, it was really important for me to say, well, I want this space not just to be a traditional kind of home, but also a place for creativity and intellectual pursuit and different people coming into my house, and a practical space and a spiritual space and a social space. So suddenly here you are, okay, now take this old Tudor space that has a certain vibe and a feel, and how can you then create your own dynamic in your own space, infusing it with all of those feelings, emotions, and actually practically panning out. So I do not just sort of, in the interest of full disclosure, the legal part of me, I do not have a background in architecture. I have friends who are architects, and I've kind of picked their brains, and I'm continuing to pick their brains as this is evolving. So I'm not an architect. I don't have a formal background in design. I just always liked it and would look at spaces from the time I was little and kind of photograph and just think of that space in that way. So I'm just excited to be able to do this with you together. I view kind of this as an evolution of process of space. The way the few weeks are going to work, just to kind of give you, if you're here for today or if you want to come for the rest of them, we will move kind of more from theoretical to practical. So looking first at foundational texts and what do some of our texts say about the whole idea of sanctity of space and how we create a sacred space, or is there even, what does that mean in biblical texts and midrashim, kind of working through Tanakh, and then we'll move in later weeks, once we establish a conceptual framework for how the concept of physical space informs who we are. We'll do some text studies, but then move more towards the actual physical structure of the Mishkan with some archaeology, early synagogues, contemporary batei midrash, and different, moving from the theoretical, from the textual, from the framework, to the actual contemporary or ancient and physical spaces, and then moving into the contemporary. So that's what we'll do over the course of the next few weeks. I did want to start as like a prior start with with an excerpt that's actually not on your source sheet. I prepared this beforehand, but an excerpt that I came across as a tribute to Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zichrono Tzadik Livracha, whose Shiva was up yesterday. There has been and there will continue to be so much written in tribute to Rav Lichtenstein. My father goes back a very long time, and our family's very close. I lived in Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush for a year. My husband studied with Rav Lichtenstein for 3 years, so I feel I want to start with a tribute to Rav Lichtenstein, but
preferably to even daven on outside, but if you want to daven with a minion, you have to find a place that has a natural.
And what is it about nature, though, that, I guess, speaks to you? So it's the outside, but something in particular about...
I think the concept of creation and that this is how, that we can look and see Hashem's presence when we look at nature. This morning, I mean, I know when I go to shul now, I go on a regular basis because I'm in my and this beautiful blossom tree had a little bird the fact that I was able to be with a minyan, say Kaddish, and look out and see these creations of Hashem in a very, very tangible, real way.
Beautiful. Right. It's
With the blue
real.
sky about the blue sky. You get the image.
Yeah. There's a sense of,
It's a feeling. It's a ruach.
and there's humility in there, right? I am standing in the context of all of this and see, and I need to see it. And I think that's just very interesting because we know that. We know that I am infinitesimal in the cosmos of the world. Nevertheless, there's something that we want to hold on to and open that window shade and latch on to whatever physicality there is in the sense of space. So you create your own kind of space. Anyone else want to weigh in or reflect on?
That I'm very sensitive to the people that are in that space. I feel like it's so multifaceted. Play upon each other.
Okay, great. So space is not just, right, a function of the physical location or the view or the connection to nature or whatever it is, but the people who are there create the vibe of the space. So you can take something that doesn't really have its own set space and create that tone by virtue of the people. And here's where then they go, where it's the people that are involved as well that create that sense of sacred space.
I'm more like her in the sense that I need to be motivated by the people around me. I'm much more of it's harder for me to do anything wherever I need to be taken. You know what I'm saying? So if ever, I need to go to a great Hallel, because, and it's not that when I daven alone I don't sing Hallel, but it's more, I'm more influenced.
And I guess here's where space influences. You can have whatever space you want, but if it's not filled with, and here's where we'll see that in just a moment. Right, so I could think of Beit Hamikdash somewhere else that I taught in that was gorgeous and had big windows and everything that you could have wanted, but it was lacking for a lot of different reasons. It was lacking that infusion of the personal element that's going to bring, right, the sense of the learning and the environment and the kehillah. So, right, there is the synergy between the physical space, the spiritual, and the components of the people. Let's take a look at some of the source material that you have. The first source here is a contemporary work on the architecture of happiness is the title of the book. I apologize, I didn't bring it today. I left it on my desk at home. Alain de Botton is a French philosopher and contemporary writer. He's written on a lot of contemporary topics, moving into the world of architecture, which is a very popular book. Would somebody like to read the first paragraph from this book on
Sure.
space? It's a great little book with wonderful pictures and his reflections on space and architecture.
We seem divided between an urge to override our senses and numb ourselves to our settings, and a contradictory impulse to acknowledge the extent to which our identities are indelibly connected to and will shift along with our locations. An ugly room can coagulate any loose suspicions as to the incompleteness of life, while a sunlit one set with honey-colored limestone tiles can lend support to whatever is most helpful within us. Belief in the significance of architecture is premised on the notion that we are, for better or for worse, different people in different places, and on the conviction that it is architecture's task to render vivid to us who we might ideally be.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's just pause there for a moment. What's the tension that he's reflecting in this paragraph? Right, there's an inherent tension that comes out
idea of beautiful and ugly and how it really does affect you. Like you might say, okay, I'm me and I can sit in this space and do whatever I want to do, but the truth is he's saying you can't. That you're, not that you can't, but it's much harder.
It's hard, and the very fact that it is, I think, yeah, it's that it's harder. It's that we are, right. There's a contradictory impulse, right. We want to acknowledge, on the one hand, I think, he wants to say that, of course, we're not impacted by our surroundings. Exactly like what you were just saying. I want to do what I'm doing, even if it's in this ugly space. Of course, I can, fulfill my potential or whatever project I want to work on or teach however I want to teach. And what does it say about humanity that we are so base, I guess, in the sense that, no, of course, we're going to be impacted by the physicality of the surrounding. And that's an inherent tension in terms of, the extent to which our identities are connected to and influenced by our locations. So on the one hand, there's that sense of, no, of course, I can go and daven wherever I want. It doesn't matter because it's me, right? Nevertheless, that's sort of lofty. We want to be able to believe that about ourselves and say that about ourselves. Nevertheless, I think the inherent reality and the contradiction is that, as he says, we are, for better or for worse, different people in different places. And you can take the most corrupt ruler and put him in the most beautiful, in the most beautiful palace, and it'll have, you vote, you can do whatever you want with the architecture, but it's the person that won't necessarily be affected. So that's sort of a flip, is that, well, on the one hand, the person is the person. On the flip side, there is that inherent tension about how much we actually are impacted. So that just kind of reflects a tension in our own understanding and desires of ourselves, our yearnings of who we want to be, and not to have that influence, yet the reality that so often we are influenced by our space. Let's continue and look at what some of the sacred texts, what some of the traditional texts in our discourse have to say about the very idea of creating a sacred space. What you have in front of you, actually we'll start with, maybe we'll do a flip actually, and turn to the next page, and we'll start first with the few psukim from Bereshit, and then go back to the psukim that I included from Shemot, from the ends of Shemot and the construction of the Mishkan. Ends of the first chapter of Bereshit, right? Perek Aleph, beginning of Bereshit, Perek Bet. We have here, actually, would someone like to read the psukim before we talk about them? Just read. Yeah, starting with that's the end of Perek Aleph, pasuk Lamed Aleph, and then it continues into Perek Bet.
Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa, v'hinei tov ma'od. Vayihi erev, vayihi boker, yom hashishi. Aleph, continue. Vayikol hashemayim ba'aretz v'chal tzva'am. Vayechav Elokim bayom hashvi'i malachto asher asa. Vayishbot bayom hashvi'i mikol malachto asher asa. Vayevarech Elokim et yom hashvi'i v'yikadesh oto.
7 days of creation, ends of Perek Aleph. What do we have when we look at sacred realms, right? The idea of a sacred realm can manifest itself in different ways. So the end of the creation of the world culminates in a sacred time, right? And not a sacred space. Right? So Bereshit, Perek Aleph, and it's Shabbat, where we have that covenantal bond with God as embodied in Shabbat, but we end with a sacred time, but not a sacred space. In Perek Bet, right, in the continuation, we do have, you don't have the source here, but just continuation in Perek Bet, we do have an example of a sacred space, right? What is that sacred space of creation? Earth and embodied in, men are put in Gan Eden, excellent, right? They're in Gan Eden in the Garden of Eden. But what happens? It doesn't last very long, right? They're thrown out. The Gan Eden is bounded to begin with, right? That idea of the sacred space is bounded, and then they're quickly thrown out. So if we could just reflect for a moment here at the beginning, what does that mean for humanity, that there's really no place for God to meet man until when?
Mishkan.
Until the construction of the Mishkan, right? That's where, God and man meet, and we'll look at those psukim and see how they, they're laden with imagery from these psukim. But let's reflect on that for a moment, that at the beginning of creation, there is no, we culminate in sacred time, but not in a sacred space. And so what does that mean for, again, just no place for God to meet man? What is that? Just think about it for a second. And I haven't formulated a great answer to it, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I never considered that notion, that there was a time when people prayed without having a particular place to do it. It was done where they were. If you were traveling, it was always Ben Adam Makom, between yourself and God, wherever you were. It wasn't in a particular place necessarily.
Right, that whole, so think now just think of the narratives of Bereshit, right? And think about, maybe this is why it was so important where Chazal say, right, when Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were mitzakin, tefilot, lasuach basadeh, means really that he went to daven. And so suddenly Chazal later on are kind of importing back on the narratives in the early narratives of the founding fathers and saying, oh look, no, they act like they found this outlet, this place, but there was no one place. So that whole encounter of man meeting God and God meeting man was without any bounded physical location.
Isn't that why they tried to put, if they built a mizbeach, or they did something to delineate that this place is,
In other words, become significant as
Right.
as Jews travel in the Torah, that when something significant happened in a
They
particular
needed a place.
it was named.
Exactly,
And
right?
this is the place that this happened, or Beit Hamikdash, wherever it was.
Right, where the Bama was, but where the Mizbeach was built.
And
And they,
people kind of want a space, but there really wasn't a particular one.
and the import later of, again, the rabbinic conception, Yahweh was here, and this is the rock, and that then became the space for, right, the Beit Hamikdash. And there were, there is also a search for that we want to root, even when we do have a space later on, we do want to root it, and in traditional thought, in a particular, place that we knew of earlier. And there are strands of that kind of, manifest themselves in lots of different ways.
Can I just say,
Sure,
and it's
please.
not insignificant that people will travel from anywhere on earth to get to the Kotel, which is the place. It's very
Right, that once it's grounded. Now, here again, so there, Bereshit has no, at the beginning of time, there is no set place. We do have Har Sinai, which actually, becomes a sacred space, but we don't exactly know where that is. Right? There is no definitive area that we can pinpoint and say, that's where it is. And then even once we get to the Mishkan, what is it about the Mishkan? Is it a particular place? No, it moves around. So even then, later on, where God does meet man on this mountain, and it's filled with, the space it trembles, and it becomes a space that's infused with power, with awe, but it doesn't continue. It's almost like a one-shot deal of the meeting. Right? They didn't have that space. They do have that space now, but that's not a sustainable space.
So it becomes what happened there. That becomes the importance of Sinai was that we received Torah.
Right, so it's experiential and transcendental as opposed to physical, this is the space. But it needed to happen somewhere, so it's almost like, again, midrashim about the mountains and which mountain was selected is less important where it happened than that it happened. But then later on, it becomes important to say, well, where is it going to happen? Because as we move and as we go and as we travel, we need to take something with us. We're not going to live on a transcendental, awe-inspiring experience all the time. There has to be some sort of physicality, but that physicality then moves around and it becomes a mobile space for the man meeting of God and God meeting man. and come
But it was
in that
still
space.
better than not having any space.
Oh, the Mishkan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
In
well,
other
well,
words,
they-
you knew you went to the Mishkan and this is what happened, and if the Mishkan was in a different place, you also went to that different place, so it was just more,
Right, and also the Mishkan is the temporary site, which is supposed to end up in a place.
Okay, yeah, so I think probably next week we'll talk about comparison between the Mikdash and the Mishkan in terms of those strands. Let's take a look at the Psukim. Now flip back. We just take a look at the Psukim.
Good. I just wanted to say that the place.
Oh, yeah, sure.
It didn't matter where the Mishkan was. The place was once you entered it, that was the place. So whether it would be on a mountain or it was by the side of the river, it didn't make a difference. It was the space.
Right, exactly. And that space can move. You know, we sometimes think about families that travel a lot or going on, you know, different expeditions, adventures, moving. They move from one place to another place. It's hard. You know, you can sometimes say to yourself, well, what matters is our space and our unit, and it's less important where we are, and that's right, parallel to the Mishkan. That's what mattered, right? The actual place where it was. But that in and of itself is a physical space. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about the Mishkan. Let's look at the construction of the Mishkan, the Psukim. At the ends, and here I just gave a selection of the flavor, not all the Psukim, but the end of Sefer Shemot, Parakim Lamed Tet through Mem. Would someone like to read through the Psukim and, we're back on the first page, just looking at the Psukim related to the Mishkan, because those Psukim, as we will see in a moment, really inherently connect with the Psukim.
so you want
in
the bottom
Bereshit.
of Lamed
Yeah,
Gimel?
the bottom where it says Shemot Lamed Tet, and then starting with Lamed Gimel.
Okay. ויביאו את המשכן אל משה, את האוהל, את כל כליו, פרסיו, כבשיו, וריחיו, ועמודיו, ועדניו. ככל אשר ציווה השם את משה, כן עשו בני ישראל את כל העבודה. וירא משה את כל המלאכה, והנה עשו אותה, כאשר ציווה השם כן עשו, ויברך אותה משה. וידבר השם אל משה לאמור, ביום החודש הראשון באחד לחודש, תקים את משכן אוהל מועד, ושמת שם את ארון העדות, וסקות על הארון את הפרוכת, ולקחת את שמן המשחה, ומשכת את המשכן ואת כל אשר בו, וקידשת אותו ואת כל כליו, והיה קודש. ויקם את החצר סביב למשכן ולמזבח, וייתן את מסך שער החצר, ויאכל משה את המלאכה.
Here's the culmination.
Can you translate that?
Sure. The English, and I'll just read it. You have the English, I'll read it. And they brought the tabernacle to Moshe, the tent, and all its furnishings, its clasps, its boards, its bars, and its pillars and its sockets. According to all that God commanded Moshe, so Bnei Israel did. Flip to the next page. All the work. And Moshe saw, Vayar, stress certain verbs here, that they had performed all the tasks as God commanded them, so they had done. Moshe blessed them. And the Lord and God spoke to Moshe, saying, on the first day of the first month, set up the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. And we'll talk about names of the Mishkan later on, also different names. Place there the ark of the pact, screen off the ark with the curtain, and take the anointing oil, anoint the tabernacle, and all that's in it to consecrate it, all its furnishings, so that it shall be holy. And he set up Vayichal, the enclosure around the tabernacle and the altar, and put up the screen for the gate. And so Moshe finished the work. When you read these psukim, there are certain things, certain verbs that should or can and do jump out. Right? The psukim related to the Mishkan are laden with imagery from Bereshit. And if we wanted to pick out each word, instead of our doing it, I just put the chart, the subsequent chart, with all the textual parallels linking creation and the Mishkan. So we read through it very quickly, but now just kind of take a look. I set it up one by one. Vayar in Bereshit, Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od. He saw and it was good. Same thing by the Mishkan. We have Vayar Moshe et kol hamlacha. V'hinei asu oto ka'asher tziva. Vayachulu in Bereshit, Parak Bet. right? It was completed. Vatechal, that same verb, that same language in Perek Lamed Tet in connection to the Mishkan. Again, Vayechal, and the next, Vayechal. That's Hamalacha. Hamalacha. The third is not just the Vayechal, but what was finished in the creation of the world. The Melachto Asher Asa, we have that same language, Vayechal Moshe et HaMelacha. And you'll have the word Melacha again by the Mishkan multiple times. And it becomes the Melachot, which are what, right? The Lamed Tet Melachot and Shabbat are all harking back to the construction of the Mishkan. So this concept of Melacha is what binds the Mishkan and Bereshit. Vayvarech Elokim et Yom HaShve'i. Similarly, we have a blessing of the seventh day. V'yavarech otam Moshe. Moshe blesses Mishkan. Vayikadesh and V'kidashta in Shemot Perek Mem. And so what we have here is an intrinsic parallel. As we read through the end of Sefer Shemot, the psukim are reminiscent of the creation story. What does that tell us? What does that mean? What's the significance of that? That it's laden with imagery. The verbs that are there. It's he saw, he completed, he blessed. It was sanctified. Those verbal similarities are designed to get us to connect the Mishkan to the creation of the world. And so looking at kind of creation side by side, if you just flip to the next page, I have an excerpt from Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, who's a professor of Tanakh at Bar Ilan University, in his book on the temple. Here's just, he kind of fleshes it out in the introduction, in one of the introductory chapters, but it's bound, right? These two events are bound, and we said beforehand that, the creation of the world ends with sacred time, but it doesn't have a sacred space, and you don't have that sacred space until the construction of the Mishkan. And so in many ways, the construction of the Mishkan completes creation. Right? On one level, I'll just read, creation ended on Shabbat. On a second level, however, it only truly concluded once the Mishkan, tabernacle work, was completed. The composite parts of the physical world were completed on the sixth day of creation, but the ultimate purpose of these elements, to be dedicated to the service of God, is only realized once the sanctuary is built, to serve as a universal focal point for the service of God. My apologies for those who are following along. I'm sorry about that. To be certain, the mere act of constructing the sanctuary will accomplish nothing if the spiritual climate of the times is inappropriate for such activity. When these conditions prevail, the presence of the sanctuary represents the spiritual completion of the times and symbolizes the completion of the creation of the universe. So there's that inherent completion of the creation of the world, in many ways, is not yet complete until the construction of the Mishkan. And side by side, reading the two accounts of the creations is designed to sort of bring us to that conclusion. And it's not right. If you just we're not going to read the midrash, but the midrash Tanchuma on Parshat Pekudei fleshes this out, linking all the verbal parallels between creation and construction, drawing the conclusion that the place of the Mishkan is equivalent to the creation of the world. That's enormous, right? That is an enormous sort of power and responsibility when we think about the Mishkan, not just as a place for an individual to worship God, right? We talked about not having that space. So now we do have that space, but that space now takes on a whole different magnitude when that space becomes, completion of creation. And it's not, again, to take it even a step further, if you flip to the next source, there is that sense of man now as being a partner in creation, right? There's the imagery of Betzalel. The Gemara in Brachot says about Betzalel, Amar Rav, Yodea haya Betzalel litzaref otiot shenivru bahen shamayim va'aretz. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav that Betzalel knew how to combine the letters through which the heavens and the earth were created. Betzalel was the architect of the Mishkan. And so the Gemara here, kind of looking at the character of Betzalel, saying Betzalel was not merely a wonderful craftsman. He was a wonderful craftsman, but not merely a wonderful craftsman. He knew how to combine the letters through which the heavens and earth were created. What does that mean? And then it provides a textual link for that with the psukim that are describing Betzalel, K'tiv Hacha v'yimalei oto ruach Elohim b'chachma, b'tfuna, u'b'da'at. Those were the qualities that he had. He was filled with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge. U'k'tiv hatam, and it says there in Mishlei, when it's talking about God's constructing the world, Hashem, same qualities. B'chachma, yisad aretz, konen shamayim b'tfuna, u'k'tiv b'da'ato tehomot nikba'u. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding established the heavens. His knowledge and his depth were broken up. Meaning we suddenly here have, yes, the Mishkan is the creation of the world, but it's also the person is now the creator, just like God was the creator. So the Gemara here is just taking the whole concept that we established as Mishkan, completing construction, a step further and putting it into the hands of the individual. Now saying that man's power and responsibility with Betzalel as creator, that man is a partner in the process of creation of the world as reflected in the construction of the Mishkan. And the imagery there, then it continues in the narratives about the Beit Hamikdash. If you look in the next source, we won't read it fully, but we're just looking at the midrash that's quoted here. Again, an excerpt from Dr. Berman's book. The narratives of the temple narratives of Shlomo's Beit Hamikdash are laden with the number 7, right? What is the importance of the number 7? The imagery continues. 7 is the days of creation. Exactly. So that imagery continues through the Mishkan to the Beit HaMikdash, right? Just as the language of the narratives about Shabbat is manifest in the construction of the Mishkan, okay, that we just read in Shemot, the Shabbat imagery likewise appears in the narratives of the Beit HaMikdash in Malachim Aleph. It took 7 years to complete. It was dedicated on Sukkot, which is a holiday of 7 days that occurs during the 7th month of the year. Shlomo's dedication speech has 7 components to it. So there is that significance. It's not just, right, oh, by the way, this is when we dedicated. All of it was done, right, for the process of creation to manifest itself now on another level. And again, looking at the significance of the mobile environment now housing itself in a particular location, there's something significant, but the idea is that just like time is sacred, now we're culminating in the process of this, the rooting of the sacred space. And the number 7 throughout the narratives of the Beit HaMikdash and the construction of the Beit HaMikdash is really, right, it grounds that, it roots that. One last source that maybe we'll read together. I know some people have to leave early, so we'll read the source and then pick up. The last text, and then we'll reflect on this together, is from a collection of essays on the Parsha, Mitoch HaOhel, and this is on Parsha Pekudei, Building the Tabernacle, Building the World, by Dr. Hecht-Koller, who's a professor of Bible at Yeshiva University. I can still share a home with me, but okay, it makes it easy to get the copies of the text there. But and on Pekudei, on this Parsha, again, linking the thematic parallels between the Mishkan, we have a number of different transitions where the first unit of Chumash now, with Mishkan on one end and Bereshit at the other, the creation of the world, that first unit, it's not just that they're parallel, but now that we've completed the first unit of Chumash. In creation, in many ways, God creates alone. He's creating by himself. He thinks, he executes, he approves, but then Moshe is shown the plan, and things are handed over. And then he instructs the people what they're to do, what are they supposed to do. And that verb, asa, to do, repeats itself more than 100 times in the construction of the Mishkan. And there's something inherent there of this is God's planning in Bereshit, now culminating in doing. Do, construct. The theoretical, the physicality, and the theoretical kind of transcends now to the physical with the doing, right? The Mishkan is being built, the people are doing, and then in creation, it sort of culminates, Bereshit, God sanctifies Shabbat, but when it comes to the Mishkan, the people are charged with. You now sanctify it. So really you have on that level, it's really kind of the end of that first unit, the culmination, but not just a parallel, but a transference of the design and the execution and the plan to the actual doing and the actual blessing going into the hands of the people. Handing off that job. The last couple paragraphs, 3 important transitions can be seen within this 2-book unit, meaning Bereshit and Shemot, which explain why this part can now come to an end. Right? Once we start Vayikra, we have a very different focus. Right? The service of the Mishkan, the Korbanot, now occupy, kind of takes on a whole new transition. And God, right, as we said, hands off to mankind the job of creation. Second, in what may be a related development, the focus is shifted from sacred time to sacred space. When God's act of creation is described, what he completes, what he blesses is a fragment of time. When human creation is narrated, they create, they complete, and give sanctity to a fragment of space. And third, God has found his home. Which we said at the beginning, there was no, we had that bounded Gan Eden, but quickly, that is no longer the place where God has his home. And God doesn't have a home, and the people don't have that place to meet God. Right? It's been observed elsewhere, and here's where comparative literature with other ancient Near Eastern texts can inform our sensibilities here. It's been observed that elsewhere in the ancient Near East, when a god is said to have created the world, the immediately following aftermath is that a temple is constructed for him. I don't have those sources here today. I'm happy to provide them, but just other ancient Near Eastern texts will show us that God creates a world, and we do have parallel texts, and then it's followed by, then a temple is immediately erected, immediately created. But in Chumash, it's switched, right? Those expectations are reversed, right? God's own creation, full of such order and promise in Bereshit Parak Aleph, crashes in the face of reality in Gan Eden and Bereshit Parak Gimel, and again in the generation of Noach. Right? The entire first part of Chumash then can be read as God's search for man, or more precisely, God's search for a sacred space among man. And then finally, in Shemot, through the orders of God, right, that place is created. The people created a space within their own space for God himself. And that's the, sort of like the dramatic end to this whole first part. And when you think about the early narratives, I think it really, it lends us to think of, it forces us, to think of the early narratives and the stories of, the Avot, and they're finding God, but it's a God without a space, without a place. And then that is transmitted, and the importance was almost finding God first. And once you find God and have that relationship, then we can hand to you the idea of constructing a space for him. And I think it informs our sensibilities in terms of our religious practices, our search for meaning, our search for spirituality. In, one, we are charged with continuing creation. And through the Mishkan, that's really what speaks to us. Transferring that sacred time to sacred space is something that evolves. It's not immediate. And that takes, sort of a development of a people. Of course, we first have to have Matan Torah as that kind of transcendent experience, and then the people can then create the space and live their spiritual lives. Thank you. Thoughts? Closing thoughts?
I guess one thing that I'm struggling with is, we've gone through this, is that without having a sense of a Mishkan and a Beit Hamikdash in terms of nowadays, I guess I'm having a really hard time I can intellectually understand what you talked about, but I don't know.
Practical, right?
Right, like it feels like nowadays, the way we connect to God, with tefillah and learning Torah, but also a lot through our actions. And at least nowadays, except for davening reflecting the korbanot, a lot of it is our deeds. that aren't connected. There are a lot of things in our relationship with God that are not connected to the Mishkan, or that's my limited understanding.
Okay, excellent. In a world, and here's where we can probably follow up in the coming weeks, in a world that was so temple-centric, right, and that was the relationship, how do you then connect to God without the temple, right? Without the Beit Hamikdash? And that's something that Chazal, the rabbis, were really struggling with, right? So think about the Mishnah, right? The Tanaim, and the early, right? The Gemara. The early rabbinic period is, in many ways, this is a how do we go on with life, religious life, in our relationship in a post-temple, way when we were so temple-centric, and that's what you see them struggling with in terms of halachic practice, right? There's developments of halacha, and there are strands of that when you're, going through those texts. That was a real struggle. So that struggle is not, it's a validated, real struggle that we can then reflect now and say, okay, correct. Now, how do we transfer that physical space and the sense of godliness to a people that are basically like bereft of that physical space?
But I think that question was a real challenge, obviously, for Jews dispersed around the world. And I think that the batei Knesset with the Ner Tamid, which was really a very clear light that had to be constantly lit in the Beit Hamikdash, has, it's an imitation of it that we have, but it's like the Mishkan was the predecessor of the Beit Hamikdash. Perhaps now that we're in Galut and we don't have a Beit Hamikdash now, that these symbolic acts that we do, and also connecting as Am Echad Lev Echad, we need each other as a people. It's not just a space. We need a place to be with other people who believe as we do. So we end up constructing sanctuaries that reflect our needs. But it has to have, we all always try to find a symbolic connection to the Beit Hamikdash through things like the Ner Tamid. And maybe it taps into memory, the memory that we have, but keeps alive the spirit of the Beit Hamikdash to Mashiach.
So transferring to other spaces, but I do want to re-emphasize maybe the sense of, well, what was the first thing there was sacred time, and
Right.
that's non-physical.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Right, that's a non-physical thing. So then if it's sacred time, then that almost means that you can then, not that one is more important than the other, but that, well, there is this whole other non-tangible concept of a sacred.
And almost that's how we started. It's like we're back to the way we
So
started.
Exactly, which makes it really interesting to think about.
On the road, he took him on the road. He left one place, and literally, it's all of the whole first part of Torah is really traveling.
Right, it's travels, it's wanders,
almost in
again, like
search
you
of,
think of,
it's
exactly, this like
What a
searching for
challenge.
God and searching for that place and searching and for cohesion through, but I would say through action. And that's really, if you had to say like, well now, right, here I am. We can recreate certain sacred spaces, mini sacred spaces, but ultimately, living a halachically oriented mind, life, a legally bound one, I think in some way also reflects that, well, we have this like cohesion of something that takes us to a place, even if we don't have the actual place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. To be continued.
Hecht-Koller.
Thank you.
Hecht-Koller.